This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 36 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, September 3rd, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Mrs. Laura D. Stone has been a recent guest at the home of her daughter, Mrs. Wallace, at the Congregational Parsonage. Her husband, David Wallace, was the pastor. Miss Blanche Waller goes to Guilford, Maine to teach this year. The Academy and the William E. Frost schools have been thoroughly cleaned and made ready for the beginning of school next Tuesday. At the Academy, some minor repairs have been made. Schools open throughout the town next Tuesday morning. Mr. Cogshaw, who has formerly taught in Stowe, will be the new Academy principal, and his assistants will be Miss Bertha A. Norris and Miss Edith Lawrence. At the Frost School, Miss Ruth Fisher, principal, will have for assistants in the other three rooms Miss Grant, Miss Burnham, and Miss Crocker, in place of Miss Cushing, retired. Westford friends have been interested in the pleasant trip Mrs. Helen R. Layton has been taking with a party of friends in Canada. During her mother's absence, Miss Frances has been staying with the Westford and Littleton relatives. Mrs. Layton has resigned her school at Hollis and accepted a desirable school at Amherst, and her daughter enters the high school at Milford, 3 miles distance, and will live with her mother at Amherst. Roy B. Wheeler in Denver, Colorado, is enjoying a visit at his boyhood home after an absence of 6 years. Roy Wheeler is the son of Reverend Winthrop F. Wheeler of Westford and the younger brother of Leonard W. Wheeler of Westford, who is frequently mentioned in the Wardsman. Their homestead was the house at what is now 66 Main Street, across the street from Whitney Playground. Mrs. Julia Fletcher and Miss Maria Chamberlain of Billerica are staying at the Reed Farm at 164 Main Street and enjoying meeting old friends in their native town. Walter J. Merritt has finished building a silo and a garage, and work on the new house he is having built is progressing well. The Westford Fire Laddies and their friends had a good time at Graniteville on last Saturday, even though they did not win the trophy, and the hospitality of the Graniteville Company is much appreciated. The next section is the About Town section. The idle, that's spelled I-D-L-E, on the Brookside Mills is off, and the mill running on Suntime, which is the idle, I-D-O-L, the unemployed have been searching after for some time. Services at the Unitarian Church will not be resumed until the second Sunday in September, owing to the incompleteness of repairs. 2 of the substantials in the Fortnightly Club, Mr. and Mrs. Edwin Gould, are playing vacation. They will take in Mount Wachusett to the extent of their eye capacity, thence northward to Mason, New Hampshire, where Mrs. Gould taught school. Reverend Seth M. Walker of Worcester is having success with his tent camp meetings as preacher of the Second Advent denomination. He has a fine personal appearance and is eloquently equipped to edify. Mrs. Frank W. Bannister has just returned from visiting in the Market Garden, Paradise of Arlington. John A. Taylor, that's Samuel Taylor's son, leaves next Tuesday for Grand Forks, North Dakota, as teacher of debating and elocution in the State University, which is coeducational. The wheat belt in the Stony Brook Valley looks more western since Amos Poley at 76 Lowell Road and CRP Decatur at 54 Lowell Road have added to the acreage of winter wheat sown. There are some rear-end men who also contemplate adding by wheat fields to western appearances. John Flynn on the Stony Brook Road on the sunny slopes of Pigeon Hill is making environments dual and durable by painting his barn red. Of the 8 ponds in Westford, one is not because of lack of rain and dew, and Grassy Pond, 1/4 of a mile north of Westford Station, has quit business, and any vessel drawing more than 4 1/2 inches of water had better not leave the harbor. Apparently they were having a bad drought in Westford in August of 1910 also. The selectmen have appointed C.L. Watt, Special Officer for Brookside. The appointment is a good one, but may be defective by the rules of technical law, as Mr. Watt lacks 25 miles of being a citizen, that being the distance to Boston, where the Court of Naturalization makes Yankees of Scotchmen. Andrew G. Anderson on the Lowell Road has the material on hand and the skill in his head for extensive repairs on his barn, which in its infancy was a part of the old Levi T. Fletcher farm barn buildings at 120 Lowell Road, or what is now 120 Lowell Road. The houses weren't numbered back then. Miss Luana Decatur, with other school teacher friends, has just returned from invigorating vacation ramblings among the mountain forests and cascades of that close-by Switzerland of America, our own New England, New Hampshire. The next paragraph is entitled Death. The funeral of Mrs. Mary Tower Smith, who died in Portland, Maine, was held from the residence of Oscar R. Spaulding Friday afternoon, August 26th. Reverend David Wallace conducted the services. The bearers were relatives, Judge Frederick A. Fisher, Alec Fisher, Robert Prescott, and Edward Hamlin. Burial in Fairview Cemetery in charge of undertaker David L. Grieg. The beauty and fragrance of the flowers were appropriate for the character of the life they wreathed on this occasion. As Miss Tower, she will be remembered by the people of Westford at her time, and especially in the old Stony Brook School District, where she was born. She was actually born on November 28, 1856, at what is now 46 Lowell Road, and was both scholar and teacher in the old historic school district. She was the youngest of the 9 daughters of Eli and Mary Fletcher Tower, and will ever be remembered by her old Stony Brook associates and friends as the bright scholar and the cheerful, unruffled spirit that was always contagious. She leaves 2 sons and a daughter. Next we come to the Forge Village section. Miss Mary Dupree, wife of Victor Dupree, died early Thursday morning, August 25th, at her home at the Groton Ridges after a long and painful illness, aged 24 years, 20 days. Besides her husband, she leaves 2 small children, Victor L. and Eva Irene, and her father, Lawrence Duffy, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. The funeral took place last Saturday morning. A high mass was celebrated in the church in Groton, Reverend C. A. Finnegan officiating. Burial was in St. Mary's Cemetery, Ayer. The bearers were Lawrence Duffy, Louis Leclerc, Fred Murray, and Henry Dupre. The Berkshire Club of Cambridge enjoyed excellent weather last week, which they spent at Camp Idle Hour on the shore of Forge Pond. Much credit is due the efforts of Robert Cabana and Herbert Sprague in managing affairs, besides being good cooks. The club entertained last week Mordecai Brown, Fred Cabana, Ned Coughlin, John Keefe, Joe Hayes, William Lee, and several others from Lowell. The boys enjoyed camp life at the lake so well that they have arrangements made to spend several weeks there next summer. Mr. and Mrs. William Kirk of Worcester are enjoying 2 weeks at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Catchpole. Miss Teresa O'Brien of Clinton was guest Saturday and Sunday of Miss Christina Lowther. We see by all of these lists of visitors how much Forge Pond was appreciated as a vacation spot 100 years ago. Mr. and Mrs. Guy Rockwell and 3 boys of Lowell are at Hollingside Cottage on the shore of Forge Pond for 2 weeks. Mrs. Henry Byron and 3 children of Marlborough are at her parents', Mr. and Mrs. Felix Leclerc, for a few weeks. Mrs. Ernest Longbottom and son William A. of Arlington has returned home after a pleasant visit with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. William Bennett. Edward T. Hanley and friend of Barbaro are enjoying this week at the beach at Hull. They will visit other places of interest before returning home. Miss Abby M. Blaisdell of Wamasett is spending this week as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. James Wilson. Mrs. John Bennett Jr. and two children are spending a month's vacation with their parents, Mr. and Mrs. E. Vickers of Stafford Springs, Connecticut. Mrs. Elizabeth Splain and her daughter, Mrs. Elmer E. Nutting, maiden name Mary E. Splain, are guests of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Rose. Mrs. Rose was another daughter of Elizabeth Splain, Margaret E. Splain of Belmont. The Mrs. Marjorie and Lillian Rose, who have been spending the summer here, will return to Belmont the last of the week to take up their school studies. Miss Lottie and Miss Mildred Parrott have returned home from North Adams, where they went the first of the summer. Cameron School will reopen for the fall term on Tuesday, September 6th. A number of young ladies who have been spending the summer at Ford's Pond are to hold a reception, which will be followed by a dance in Abbott Hall on Saturday evening. Music for the occasion will be furnished by Miss Sarah Precious, piano, James H. Brown, violin, and Norman Nichols, drums. Admission will be by invitation. Next, we have a few paragraphs on the fireman's muster. Saturday proved to be a red-letter day here when the John Edwards Hose Company won the Silver Cup at the fireman's muster at Graniteville. The rules at the tryout were that each company should carry, and there were three companies, one from Westford Center, one from Ford's Village, and one from Graniteville. The rules of the tryout were that each company should carry 100 feet of hose, run 100 yards, connect it to hydrants, couple the two lengths of hose, and start water. The company making the best time to take the silver trophy. The E.M. Abbott Hose Company of Westford, the A.R. Schote Hose Company of Graniteville, and the John Edwards Hose Company of this village, that is Ford's Village, were the contestants. The John Edwards Hose Company was the only team to make 3 connections in 29 1/5 seconds without a leak. The flag was hoisted over the hose house, and everything was in readiness to receive the victorious firemen on their return home. When they came into view, mounted on the large fire wagon with their trainer, Findamore Morton, holding the silver cup, the people went wild for a few minutes. Cheer after cheer rent the air. Everyone turned out. Flags were flying. Hats were thrown up into the air, and it was impossible for the firemen to proceed. At Post Office Square, the men marched behind the wagon 2 by 2 until the hose house was reached. Here they saluted the flag. Cheers again burst forth, and at night the people walked the streets, and not until midnight did the cheers die away. Hanley and Company presented the firemen a box of cigars. Victor Pigeon also contributed a box of cigars, and the other stores sent refreshments. It was indeed the firemen's day. Thursday evening at Abbott Hall, the firemen observed Ladies' Night in honor of the event. Dancing was enjoyed from 7:30 until a late hour. Refreshments of ice cream, cake, and coffee were served during the evening. And I have a feeling other refreshments may have also been served. By special request, Captain Richard D. Prescott, who sent in his resignation to take effect September 1st, has decided to remain captain of the Hose Company. Captain Prescott is a valued member of the Hose Company and has given his service freely and the use of his horses when needed. The firemen specially requested him to remain with the team some time longer. And that's the news in Westford for the week ending September 3rd, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Westford Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.